The single most significant development over the later part of the 20th century has been changes to gendered practice. This has meant that the sense of self for many women is no longer tied to their marital status. Women climb mountains, fight in frontline battles, act as CEOs. They are sometimes the chair of a board. They paint, they sing, and they dance. The adage, women can do anything, however, becomes strained when children come along. This is much more than a divide between career and family. This is something that strikes at the heart of our sense of self. It's a tension that authors reflect on in the Australian book, The Divided Heart, where artists, writers and actors speak frankly about the wrench they feel between being a mother and their artistic life. This is clearly a gendered divide because it's simply not the same for men. A topic taken up by Louise Guyler, another Australian book, The Gendered Unconscious. This is a topic for continuing debate, but for today we will turn to some examples of the many and varied materials from across the disciplines that don our shelves on what it means to be a mother today. Some of these are beautifully written, and by way of example, we will start with a paragraph from The Blue Jay's Dance by Louise Edrich. There is a dance that appears out of nowhere. Steps we don't know we know until using them to calm our baby. This dance is something we learn in our sleep, from our own hearts, from our parents going back and back through all of our ancestors. Men and women do the same dance and acquire it without a thought. Graceful, eccentric. This wave-like sway is the skilled graciousness of the entire body. Parents possess and lose it after the first fleeting months, but that's all right, because already it has been passed on, the knowledge lodged deep within the comforted baby. A reference that straddles both the topic of the last session and this is a text called Maternal Desire by Daphne de Marnefe. It is important because, as with the topic of the last session, it examines critical connections between women as mothers and their infant child, though in its findings it stands apart. It seems to me that there is a clear distinction between de Marnefe's conclusions and those of Benjamin Holloway and Barista. These later authors provide a pathway for thinking through disconnects between mothers and their infant child, while de Marnefe's analysis, also drawing from psychoanalysis, expands on deep and abiding connections. There are important overlaps between these four authors, never more evident than in the recognition of powerful connections between mothers and their children. But what stands them apart is this central difference. A discussion of these topics could certainly provide the basis for an excellent article, and I commend their work for your consideration. Well, getting on to philosophy, literature, and a little art. A body of work that is concerned with the maternal, running parallel to the rethinking of welfare economics, the social structuring of care, is situated between philosophy and language. Some of this has been inspired by a re-examination of notions from within psychoanalysis, for example, both Lucy Irigaray and Julia Kristeva, who challenged the paternal emphasis built into psychoanalysis by what they say was writing out the maternal. This emphasis has been captured in the phrase, white ink, bringing to light the invisible, the unspoken. And Irigaray and Kristeva were quite big names within gender studies and women's studies in the 1990s. And I don't think they're writing quite as much as they were at that time, but they've got significant publications out there. Both authors have set out to articulate difference and challenge notions that reify patriarchal domination through language and the symbolic by representing female experience. And a lot of this work has become, quite difficult to read because it gets into philosophy and psychoanalysis and, it takes a while to really understand the notions that they're on about. Their work gives rise to a conception of gender difference that has been grounded in the female body, and that's been a problem, this problem, what they call of essentialism, because you're born with a female body, it means certain other things, and there's been great attempts within gender studies and women's studies to move past that embodiment. Laura Green discusses the implications of some of this work and provides for new ways of thinking in a paper I've linked to the Wikispaces titled Myths, Matricide and Maternal Subjectivity in Irigare. And again, it won't be something that all of you will be interested in, but if you have the time and space and you think you might be interested, it's there for you to have a look at. I understand that this branch of thinking isn't going to be of interest to all. I'm noting it as an important branch of study that has been of interest to some feminist thinkers. The early years after the birth of an infant has been recognised as critical to aspirations for gender equity, and yet practices established in these early years can feed into entrenched gender divides. There's been exponential growth in the popular discourse of women reflecting on their experience after becoming a mother, along with the emergence of political movements for change. And I will talk more about some of these books later under Self-Help and Politics. And by the way, talking about this gender difference, attention between gender difference and gender equity, I've linked on the associated text document in the footnotes. You'll see something about a divide in between feminist perspectives on gender difference and gender equity, and there's quite a lot of work along those lines. The literature on mothering motherhood is ever expanding and includes autobiographical pieces in which women describe and reflect on the associated meanings and practices. The links with identity for women as mothers are evident through the power of the Good Mother discourse. Here below I provide an outline by way of example, firstly starting with a couple of classics. Researchers on gender often take a cross-disciplinary approach, drawing together literature, philosophy, history and more. The 1970s spawned some excellent texts in this regard, many of which have become classics. And Adrienne Rich's Of Women Born is one such example. As Rich is a poet, this is a beautifully written book that spans philosophy, history, sociology and poetry, drawing these threads together while reflecting on her life and experience with her own children. And again, because it was written in the 70s, probably anyone who is of that era would recognise the signs of the period. It's probably dated in that way. Anyone who this is new to might balk sometimes at some of the things she says, but you've got to remember the milieu in which it was written. It was a time of great activity in terms of women movements for change, and Rich was a central part of those movements, and in some ways they were inspired. And a lot of the contemporary critiques can easily pull apart some of their grand statements. There's been much more, the work today is not trying to speak for all women. That was one of the problems. I think there was one of the books, Sisterhood is Powerful, with the assumption that, all women are sisters, and not recognising divides between women, in terms of class and gender and race, and not gender, but class and race. And, so, yeah, I think the more contemporary work is more careful in that way. But anyway, it's a classic and something good to know of. This book is political, and it sets a steep agenda for change that was necessarily a part of these 70s movements, and going back to it reminds me of an idealism that was a characterising feature. Sadly, over recent years, activists such as Rich have passed away. No doubt she will have been disappointed and critical of many contemporary practices, but it's important to remember that changes to gendered practice is the single most significant trend over the second part of the 20th century, as I mentioned earlier. Rich asserted that the inclusion of men with childcare was a revolutionary aim. And so in that sense, she'd be pleased to see a lot that has taken place. In her words, it would not only change the expectations children, and therefore men, have of women and men, nor would it simply break down gendered roles and diversify the work patterns of both sexes. It would change the entire community's relationship to childhood. And in many ways that's true. There's, even though it's not really obvious, in the newspapers or, in the general discourse, it's certainly obvious in the branch of analysis that looks at the whole thing about the social structuring of care and the kinds of topics that looks at what I call the macrosocial issues. A central contribution of this book by Rich is a distinction that she made between the experience of being a mother and an institutionalisation of motherhood that is perpetuated through social policy and practice. And that continues to be an important distinction there. A second edition of Rich's book was published in 1986, and in this she included a new introduction which reflected on her work in light of developments. Like the work of Nancy Chodorow that I mentioned in the last session, this work has been a classic in the field and a necessary read for anyone who wanted to pursue topics related to being a mother today. The work of Rich and Chodorow also mark a second important distinction evident within this field, and that is the distinction between an analytical approach to the topic of motherhood and a descriptive approach. Something I mentioned just a few minutes ago. The first of these is concerned with the macro-social dimension of social structure and the part played by cultural practice, whereas there is a much larger body of work on the microsocial, the interpersonal, the experience of being a mother. Both of these bodies of work are important, the first by way of critique, but the second often provides a means for women to reflect on their everyday experience and can provide for solace and understanding. Rich and Chodorow both fall within this first group, along with the work of Eva Kitty, Martha Fineman, Wendy Holloway, Lucy Irigaray, Julia Kristeva and Kelly Oliver, amongst others. A long-held debate within feminism has been between proponents of a gender equity position and those who uphold the centrality of gender difference. And this is something that I mentioned is in the notes as a footnote. And the contours of the debate have been refined in the work of Eva Kitty and Martha Fineman. This work brings together concerns regarding equity and diversity with issues regarding dependency or care. And obviously care is importantly associated with being a mother. That's what women do as mothers, they care, in the big sense of the word. Dependency theory provides analytical categories that are useful for locating the social position of the primary caregiver, particularly in the early years after the birth. Dependency is a feature of the human condition, and thus there are inevitable interdependencies that are associated with infancy and childhood, illness, disability, and with frail old age. And it's interesting to look at the recent changes now in Australia that the government have brought in terms of disability, the disability allowance. There's a recognition of the importance of that work and that we need to support the people who do the work, of this important work of care. The patriarchal marriage, which is carried over through institutional practice, relies on gendered roles, whereby women, generally, as dependency workers, are held apart from claims to equity. and those statements are covering up many kind of books and theses on this whole social structuring. It's a topic in itself, but it importantly frames the experience of women as mothers. This project by Kitty, together with the work of Ruth Lister on citizenship, Susan Moller-Olkin on justice, and Martha Feynman on social contract, contextualise issues often experienced by women as mothers. This work provides a platform to identify and articulate factors that contribute to the contradictory nature of the dynamics. Feynman argues that our philosophical heritage is based on the myth of an independent, autonomous individual that does not account for care. Our health and well-being is dependent on care. Wendy Holloway talks about this in terms of the development of a capacity to care. The issues go deeper than more childcare and changes to workplace practice, though these are important. There are calls for substantial institutional change that is cognizant of the central role of care to well-being. Care has become the casualty of an insufficient response in the law, the labour market, schools, the institutions of care, and cultural constructions of motherhood, with a contemporary trend towards intensive mothering. Ali Hochschild coined the term the second shift, which is widely used to refer to the work that women most often do after a full day in the workplace in order to attend to the many and varied requirements of care. Patrice Di Quincio titled her work The Impossibility of Motherhood because of a continuing reliance on an independent worker model within the workplace that does not account for care. And Susan Musart's book, The Mask of Motherhood, that circulated through book clubs for some time in the 1990s, brought attention to a silencing of these associated issues. Though it's probably a bit harder to argue there's been a silencing now. This is a topic that comes up often in the media. But going back to the earlier mentioned distinctions between critique and description, here below are some references from a larger body of work that falls within a second group that describe rather than analyse this everyday experience. A couple of the 1970s classics that were republished in the 80s includes Phyllis Chesler's book, The Diary of Motherhood. This is divided into 3 sections: the pregnancy, the birth, and motherhood. In this, Chesler writes out her innermost thoughts and feelings as she moves up to the first year after the birth. This later version also includes an afterword, now that her child has become an adult, and another by Jane Lazaret, The Mother Not. This one was important to me when my children were small. As I had my children late in life, this could have been because it was written by a woman of my generation, but this for me was a chance meeting with a friend, someone I could understand and who in turn understood me. Lazaret talked about her everyday experiences of being a mum, the good, the bad, and the bad, while leaving room for ambivalence and uncertainty. In this honest and moving book, Jane Lazaret explores her own experiences of motherhood, the joy of feeling her baby move inside her, the pain and wonder of giving birth, the exhaustion of caring for a demanding newborn, the transformation of her identity and her conflicting feelings of pleasure, fear, helplessness, love, and guilt. I'll go back to a couple more examples of these, what I call descriptive works on, the everyday experience of being a mother. But first I thought I'd give some examples of a burgeoning field of artwork. And if you did a Google search on image with mother and art, you'll see there's fantastic examples there readily available. So some examples of this that I came across is this ancient fertility symbol that from antiquity in the early temples that you'll find, they found these kind of remnants of these kind of statues that were in recognition of the part that the fertility that women were able to reproduce, and in awe of it. This other second one by Mary Cassatt, she was an artist in the late 1900s, and you can see more of her work in a Wikipedia entry that you'll see linked in the associated text document. And there's also I found an online lecture that only goes for 17 minutes with an art historian speaking about her work, which was she was part of the Impressionist movement, and there's lots of beautiful images that she worked on. Interestingly, though, I learned that she never did have a child, which is really interesting. This was followed by many contemporary artists who are now doing these kind of images of mothers with their children. And this is just a few examples of these contemporary works that are really lovely. This first one is a statue that's located in New York of the female body, the pregnant body with the baby there, ready, well formed, and looks like it's ready to be born. And it reminds me of the statue that was recently, in the last decade, acquired by the National Gallery, of the woman who looks like she's in labour, very, very much pregnant, and it's, the life-size statue, and it's, very good to see that it's there, being represented and acknowledged. These other two that follow are more contemporary artists, and you'll see the mother and child are represented in different ways. And here the mother, while she's trying to cook with the baby, being depicted in a kind of more cartoonish way. This last one is an African mother dance, which is, again, interesting to see. Probably something that's been happening over generations and millennia, but now it's been depicted in the art forms, because women are artists and they're interested in these kinds of things. Today, women are most often having their children later in life. The average age of an Australian in Australia today is in the early 30s. These mums have often travelled and are used to an independent income. They have generally had enough time in the workforce to have built up extensive experience, which may well have blossomed into a career. This generation of mums have had access to education that had only been dreamed of by earlier generations, whose opportunities and expectations were truncated by social norms. The life course of contemporary mothers has often contributed to a strong sense of self. So once confronted by what is often a massive gap between their expectations and their experience, and armed with education and an ability to write, they take up the pen, both to reflect on and articulate their way it seems to them. And not just the pen, obviously. They take up the brush, and they depict their experience in art forms, in music, in literature.